everyone, and welcome to Fairy Tales in 5 Minutes. As always, if you want to skip straight to the good stuff, I will leave a timestamp in the comments down below for you so that you can get right to the fairy tale. But if you're new or you need a refresher course, here's how this works. I have a list of words, concepts, and phrases that usually pop up in these types of stories. I generate 5 words off that list at random by rolling a die, and then whatever words are associated with the numbers that I rolled, those words then need to appear in the fairy tale that I write. I give myself 1 hour to write that fairy tale and then time it to make sure that it's no longer than 5 spoken minutes in length. That final product is what you are getting today. Just as a side note, anytime a word that's on that list comes up in the story, it will also pop up on your screen. So keep an eye out for those, and away we go. It was an otherwise ordinary morning when Ella found an unconscious man on the path between her cozy cottage and her favorite freshwater spring. It was certainly not the first time that strangers had wandered up here only to find themselves out of their depth, but it was the first time the victim looked so strangely familiar. She checked him for injuries, then gave a whistle that her horse had been well trained to recognize for these types of situations. With the help of her trusty steed, she managed to get the man onto his back and safely to her home. When he came to consciousness some hours later, wrapped in blankets and placed in front of a roaring fire, she could see the fear in his bleary eyes. "You're all right," she said, keeping her voice soft. "You're in the mountains. Do you remember what happened?" But he simply shook his head. She never minded taking care of the people who found their way to her, but this guest quickly became her favorite. Obliging and eager to help, he followed all of her directions to a T, and before long he was feeling healthy enough to help with the chores and the cooking, even though she said he didn't need to. Still, every time she asked him what had brought him here, he had no answer for her. He never quite met her eyes when he said he couldn't remember what had happened to him, but she never pointed that out. He'd talk when he was ready. Turned out she'd find out without him. Once in a while, there were things she needed from the nearest town. She asked if he wanted to go with her, but he said no. He'd been meaning to do some exploring anyway. So she gathered him some supplies in case he needed them and headed out on her own. When she arrived in the market square, the first thing she noticed was the extremely familiar face staring out at her from the missing posters that papered the shop windows. The king's son. She'd been harboring the crown prince. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" she demanded, the moment she burst through the door. He went pale, but his voice was steady when he explained. He'd spent his whole life under lock and key. Every decision had been made for him. When his father had decided that his wife was to be chosen at a ball thrown on his next birthday, which he admitted was today, it was the last straw. He'd snuck out of his chamber window just after midnight and struck out on his own. He knew the forests well, but he hadn't ever explored the mountains before, and he'd gotten lost. "I can't go back," he said. "No one there ever sees me, just the prince." "I understand," she murmured. "But they need to know that you're all right. Go back, just for tonight. Let them see you, and then we'll leave." He looked at her, expression tormented. "Promise me." She nodded, taking his hands in hers. "I promise." He drew a deep breath as if bracing himself for something terrible, and agreed. Since she knew the safest routes, she led the way back to the castle. Perhaps because they were both dreading it so much, they seemed to arrive much sooner than either of them expected. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" he asked when they had reached the outskirts of the grounds. But she shook her head. In a half-playful homage to his original decision to run away, she said that if he didn't return by midnight, she'd know that he'd changed his mind and decided to stay in the castle. He smiled at her, fleetingly, nervously. In one quick movement, he plucked a rose off a nearby bush and pressed it gently into her hands. "I'll come back as soon as I can." From where she sat, she could hear the grandfather clock in the ballroom every time it chimed. That's how she knew exactly when midnight came. And went. She was just about to leave when she heard hooves. Too many hooves. There was no moon. She could barely see, but she could tell there were far too many shapes on the horizon. But she recognized the voice that shouted, "Go! I'll catch up." So she went. She went so fast that her slippers, stretched out from years of wear, actually fell off her feet as she spurred her horse into the fastest gallop of either of their lives. But they'd prepared for this, too. There were shortcuts and pathways, near invisible to anyone who didn't know how to spot them, and she'd taught him exactly where to find them. It took him far longer than it took her, but he did arrive, wind-swept and laughing, at the door to her cottage, just as the sun peeked over the horizon. And they lived happily ever after. Okay, well, I hope you had fun, because I certainly did. Let's find out what's next, shall we? We will have royalty, a wish, some light, a beast, and an enchanted sleep. Okay, well, I don't know what any of that means, but we will find out, won't we? If you're interested in the Back to School series, there will be a video on Monday that's probably more student-driven. If not, I'll see you back here on Thursday for whatever on earth happens with this next fairy tale. And if you want to, feel free to play Spot the Cinderella reference with our most recent tale in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.